He found what he had said was, look, it was what we'd call a traditional flying saucer. Military intelligence put out a press release, said saucer recovered. Headlines, boom, across the country. And Dad said, that guy was a smart aleck. And I said, and he didn't know what he was talking about.
Let's talk about Roswell and what happened there.
All right, 1947, Roswell, New Mexico. You got to remember, America, it was not the Air Force, it's the Army Air Corps. And that's important because I'm going to tell you something that happened to me later in life dealing with that. A farmer, there was a loud explosion, and later the next day, a farmer was out I'm just paraphrasing all this, some of this might not be. He found some material. He found what he had said was, look, it was what we'd call a traditional flying saucer. But flying saucer was a terminology that had been used, wasn't quite the terminology, you know. He reported it. The military came in, Army Air Corps at Roswell, and military intelligence put out a press release, said saucer recovered. Headlines, boom, across the country. Then the next day, they came in and said, oh, it wasn't a flying saucer. It was a hot air balloon. And they bring this poor colonel out, and he's showing, there's famous pictures of him showing it's clearly a couple of some kind of balloon apparatus. So military intelligence went from a flying saucer to a pile of cloth and sticks in 24 hours. And the American public believed it because that's what we're trained to do. We believe our military and we believe the press back then. And so it gets kind of it covered up, and there's talk of bodies and craft and everything. And then in a chance conversation later, some people were talking about it in the military, and then it all just came out. You know, some of them had gotten some of this material, and literally they said you could crinkle it up. And I've heard this in other instances, and you could throw it down on a table and it would come back out to its original shape. There was some of the sticks had hieroglyphics. They said it was a purple hewn to it, I think. Well, the United States Air Force comes out, and I remembered it was called Roswell, case closed is what they called it. And they had this fat second lieutenant. He was a smart aleck. And they gave a press conference, and they said, no, it was a hot air balloon. And they said, well, what about the little people that they found? Well, 3 years later or 4 years later, we did some experiments with dummies. We parachuted dummies down, little small dummies. And we think that people just sort of carried this over a course of 4 or 5 years, and they put this all together into this one story. And that's what they put out. And I remember my dad, I talk a lot about my mom and dad, God gives us all gifts, I think. And one gift that my dad had that I have is the gift of perception. And I said, what'd you think, Daddy? We watched that press conference on TV. It was early days of cable. And Dad said, that guy was a smart aleck. And I said, and he didn't know what he was talking about. And my dad wasn't a UFO guy or anything.
Yeah.
Well, I have a truck and trailer business years later. And I was in the state legislature as part-time in Tennessee. And I was putting a guy's trailer hitch on. I remember he had a Jeep, and he was sitting in my shop with me. And I looked at his tags. It said New Mexico. I said, New Mexico? I said, you ever heard of Roswell? And he goes, yeah. My dad was in the Army Air Corps. He didn't say Air Force. He said the Air Corps. So I said, really? I said, and I remember I was putting that thing on. And I was just like, so I said, well, tell me, you heard it? Did he ever talk about that UFO thing? He said, yeah. As a matter of fact, he did. He said, and it said, we always thought there was a midair collision. And there was two. And so, but in Roswell, you'll hear about this. I've pieced this together. We used a different kind of radio. It was electromagnetic something. We just started experimenting with it. And apparently, allegedly these craft, if you hear of, there's always the use of this type of whatever it is. I'm not the scientist, but apparently it has some effect on these things. And so and there was another crash somewhere else in the world on the same day, another alleged craft recovery. So Roswell, New Mexico, covered up. I believe that was one of the first ones that but there's been documentation. There was one at the turn of the century, an aircraft. It talked about an aircraft down in Texas, which was before you would see an airplane in the early, it was either 1907 or early teens, where aircraft were not that common. And there's been others, but that was the one that everybody kind of hangs on. And I'm sure there's others that have been covered up. But I feel like that's what I think.
Do you think that...
But I think it's been so compartmentalized, we'll never know the real story on that.
I mean, those bodies are said to be in a, if I remember correctly, a blue room in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base?
Right, Pat, yeah. And I would say, Speaker McCarthy said to me one day, he said, "Hey, man, I'm getting ready to get a Codell maybe to Area 51. Would you like to go?" I said, "Yeah, I'll go." I said, "You're not going to go down there to see any aliens." And I said, "You're not going to see anything else." And he said, "Oh, what do you mean?" I said, "It's just a tourist trap now. I mean, Congress is going to call and we're going to go down there and they're going to open up some vault and show us something. Get real. I mean, it's the arrogance and stupidity, I guess, of not of the speaker, but of just, to think that this group, they operate, dude, they stay.
Very naive.
There was an old lobbyist in Nashville, and I always remember his name was Tom Hensley. He's the Golden Goose. He's since passed away. He's a dear friend of mine. He was the liquor lobbyist, and I never voted for his bills, but he always loved me because had a dear friend from Knoxville, a guy named Pat Scruggs, who was a liquor distributor, and told Tom to be my buddy. So he was my buddy. And I remember him sitting there at the Crown Plaza one night, and some young hotshot with the governor's office was running his mouth and said, "Well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that." And I remember he had his little fancy bottle of glass of Jack Daniels. He was smoking this old cigar, big old cigar, and he drank it. And the guy walks off and he said, "Burchett," he said, "governors come and go, but the old goose will be sitting right here." And that's the way these guys are, man. They're going to be sitting there, and they're going to be running this thing. Congressmen come and go, and it just keeps, and the longer it takes, the deeper it gets, and the more compartmentalized it gets. So my other theory on this is that people that are analyzing these things don't know what they're analyzing.
How so?
They don't know that they're craft, or they don't know it's foreign. They just know it's something that they're analyzing. They're analyzing a piece of metal. They're analyzing a mechanical apparatus. They don't know if it's from an aircraft. They don't know if it's from a submarine. They don't have to know.
Hey everybody, I'm Shawn Ryan. Click here to subscribe to the Shawn Ryan Show YouTube channel for the hottest and most compelling interviews that you will not see anywhere else. I've also made a playlist of all the previous SRS episodes so they're easy to find. You can find that right here.